This video is sponsored by Squarespace, where you can find all the tools you need to build an elegant, custom website for your projects, portfolio, business, whatever you need, all in one place. You might have noticed a narrative pattern in recent years with the surge of Asian American stories. The mother-daughter relationships, the cultural divides, generational trauma, not quite feeling at home in either group or place. That's not to say these recurring themes are somehow exclusive to Asian stories, but looking back, I found that a large majority of Asian American and Asian Canadian properties center on some kind of clash within families or a cultural identity crisis. And this extends to the literature too, fiction and nonfiction. The more I observed this, the more it reminded me of one particular story. You might recall in my Crazy Rich Asians video that it was the first major Hollywood film with an all-Asian cast in 25 years. Well, the previous movie was 1993's The Joy Luck Club, based on the best-selling novel by Amy Tan. The influence of The Joy Luck Club is massive. You might have even had to read it as part of your high school English curriculum. It was one of the first instances where Asian American experiences were the focal point of the story. And it's hard to find any Asian American projects that don't have at least 1 or 2 degrees of separation from it. The first Asian Disney princess, the first primetime Asian American family sitcom, the next family sitcom 25 years later, and the next major Hollywood film with a majority Asian cast. There's an interconnective thread between all of these stories that paint a portrait of an invisible community yearning to be seen. And while it came out over 30 years ago, it still seems to resonate.
In many ways, I think the film really was way ahead of its time, and if anything, it might still be.
I was mind blown at how amazing it actually was.
I also saw a lot of that growing up among my friends and my peers. It was a very relatable movie.
I actually didn't expect to like the movie as much as I did. This movie has aged really well in a way that I'm surprised there's not more discourse about.
It definitely feels like a period piece, which is so funny to say because it's only from the 90s.
Probably when I was too young to actually watch it. And I remember just being glued to the TV and crying my eyes out and half understanding what it was, but also deeply, deeply connecting with that intergenerational conversation that it had excavated for all of us Asian Americans.
There's so many characters, so it is kind of confusing to read. But overall, I liked the book experience, and I also liked watching the movie. The movie's also confusing because it does the flashback things again.
So what Cheyenne is referring to is the structure of the story. 8 characters, 4 moms, 4 daughters, and how they all connect. It started out as a bunch of separate short stories, and now the chapters are sort of loosely organized like a game of mahjong. Every detail I found in researching this movie and novel reflected so many nuances of Asian American history. I kept unearthing the cyclical struggle to get them made, the perpetual balancing act of needing to get it right and make it authentic, and the fight to assure studio executives that our stories are worth being told. This video means a lot to me. For the better part of the last year, all of my videos have had something to do with Asian American media. It wasn't even on purpose, but over the course of 2023, I just kept finding myself falling down the rabbit hole of how these stories came to be and the effect they've had on popular culture. In this time, I've grown more and more passionate about our experiences in media, so I thought it would be fitting to go back to where it started, to the roots, so to speak, of Asian American representation. I want to quickly thank everybody who took the time to chat. I interviewed 9 people with a wide range of backgrounds. We're a small sample of just how diverse our community is, and at the same time how these experiences connect us. You'll see them pop up in the video, and I link them in the description along with our Patreon, where you can hear all the conversations in full. There were so many good moments, I couldn't fit them all. You might have noticed I only make a few videos a year, and Steph often co-writes, because I still have a full-time job and it's just the 2 of us doing all the research, editing, and writing. I'm hoping to make the leap to full-time video making, but it's getting tough with YouTube's AdSense policies. So if you enjoy our video, consider supporting the channel over on Patreon. We post weekly with updates on what we're working on, and bonus videos like reviews and behind the scenes. Every patron we get makes it a little more manageable to keep making videos like this, and with all the love and care they deserve. So I hope to see y'all there.
Oh, that people are so sincere.
Prior to 1993, there'd only been one Hollywood movie to have a predominantly Asian cast, 1961's Flower Drum Song. If you've been keeping score at home, that's 3 Hollywood films in a roughly 60-year span. Flower Drum Song was a musical based on a Broadway play based on a novel by C.Y. Lee, following a Chinese immigrant woman in San Francisco as she finds love in her new home. I mean, it's a little more complicated than that, but you get it. Even in 1961, with its highly choreographed musical numbers, the narrative themes for this Asian American story centered on the precarious act of maintaining one culture while learning how to be part of a new one.
What are we going to do about the other generation?
And although it was generally considered a success, the lasting impact of the film wasn't that it opened the door for Asian actors, but rather it was considered the definitive example of Asian American stories lacking so-called universal appeal. After Flower Drum Song, Asian actors were still relegated to the tertiary roles of foreigners, servants, shopkeepers, and occasionally martial artists or drug trafficking gangsters. And Asian creatives behind the scenes were scarce, if not unheard of. Regardless, the film cemented intergenerational relationships as a recurring motif in Asian American stories.
She came to this country the regular way, through her mother.
It had already been a prominent theme in our literature. Specifically, portrayals of mother-daughter relationships date back to autobiographical works like Jade Snow Wong's Fifth Chinese Daughter, and pop up again in The Woman Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston. But none of them achieved the renown of the Joy Luck Club.
This was the first book to really cross over into becoming a mainstream, mass-market success.
Tan based her writing debut on her own relationship with her mother, but while her novels usually feature elements from her personal life, they weren't exactly autobiographical.
Everybody's novel is semi-autobiographical. I mean, you have questions or the way you think of life or the kind of people you think are interesting, people who have impacted your life and made you who you are.
There were so few books on Asian American at the time, and this book is quite authentic in the exploration of mother-daughter relationship. My name is Anne Chow, and I am actually a modern Chinese historian. The fact that it was such an interesting story and it had 4 different sets of mother-daughter and they're all different variations of relationship, that put focus on women. I think it did allow authors to start thinking, there's a lot more variations on that we can explore.
Prior to the Joy Luck Club's publication, there was already a wave of literature appealing to the unheard experiences of women regarding sexuality, domesticity, and inequalities, among other things. Joy Luck felt like a natural extension of this exploration, as it provided a glimpse into perspectives that were entirely unknown to a large portion of America, but intimately true to another. When I first read the novel a few years ago, I cried, and as I progressed through the pages, I thought about my own relationship with my mother, and how little I really knew about her. The experiences she had while fleeing a war-torn country, what it must have been like to uproot her life and start anew in a place she had no connection to. It made me reconsider our entire relationship and helped me appreciate her in a new light, beyond simply being the person who raised me. Tan later reflected on the unexpected success of the novel, writing,
"Before the Joy Luck Club was published in 1989, I told my husband that my novel would be on bookstore shelves for about 6 weeks and then disappear into the shredder. I had heard this was the case with most first novels, and there was no reason to expect mine would fare any better. In fact, it might do worse. After all, these were quirky stories, written by an unknown Chinese-American author. And in those days, books that were non-mainstream were termed ethnic, enjoyed by special readers. The characters are mothers who immigrated from China and their modern 30-something American-born daughters. Who would pay to read that? Over the last 30 years, I continue to be grateful and amazed by the answer. Many."
Eventually, the novel fell into the hands of director Wayne Wong, who approached Tan about adapting her story into film. Even with the book's success, it was a Herculean task to adapt. Wong was one of the few directors of Asian descent making films in general, let alone one starring Asian Americans. I get the sense he wanted to showcase stories that depicted us in the same vein that white characters could exist on screen. Multifaceted people going through relationship problems and life struggles that didn't always revolve around race, or at least didn't feature xenophobic stereotypes.
You're a foreigner here, you know that?
His films were generally well received critically, but they were small budget affairs that didn't make much noise in the box office. He once said, "If you look at all the films I made before then, other than Slam Dance, they were all Chinese American films, and I really believed in carrying that torch, but it was getting to me because it was so hard."
I think all Asian Americans kind of feel the weight of having to fit into a very, very small space that American culture allows us to exist in. I'm Kimmy Yam. I'm a reporter at NBC News. I cover Asian America, culture, and politics. Ultimately, it put onto screen and into words kind of this feeling that a lot of us had been struggling with that perhaps we had not seen before on screen or even in real life, like just kind of these conversations that kind of needed to be forced for a while.
In the 30-year gap between Flower Drum Song and the Joy Luck Club, a self-fulfilling prophecy had, well, fulfilled itself. Asian actors were not bankable stars. This belief discouraged studios from funding Asian-led projects while also discouraging Asian American communities from supporting careers in the film industry. More often than not, immigrant families didn't care to encourage a path that so clearly lacked opportunity after they uprooted their lives to provide opportunities for their children. But the fallacy here is that Asian American talent were never given the chance to prove or disprove this notion. There weren't dozens or even a handful of well-funded movies starring Asians that failed in the box office to give the idea any merit. No pattern of audience disinterest for Asian actors or stories. It was just kind of accepted as fact. But eventually, Wong and Tan were able to secure financial support from an unlikely source. Most of us probably know Oliver Stone for writing and directing films like Scarface, Platoon, JFK, Natural Born Killers, the list goes on. His films gained a reputation for their violence and grit, often centered on men. In the 80s, he'd come under fire in the Asian American community for writing the screenplay for Year of the Dragon, a crime drama featuring Asian women being brutalized at the hands of Asian men, until the aptly named Captain White comes through to clean up their neighborhood.
The most decorated cop in New York City has declared war on Chinatown.
One of Stone's most vocal critics was Wayne Wong. The two had public spats where Wong called Stone's characters violent and evil, while Stone called Wong's films boring. Knowing all this, it was surprising to see Stone as one of the executive producers, but somewhere along the way, he and Wong set aside their differences and put the project into motion.
It was interesting to see his name attached to it because I was going, well, that makes a lot of sense, because for a predominantly Asian project like that to be made in the time period, it makes complete sense that you need some established, probably white, maybe not necessarily, but somebody established in the industry already to attach to it. You need an ally, you know?
Though even with Stone's cosign, only one studio agreed to distribute the movie, Hollywood Pictures, a subsidiary of Disney. Shockingly, Disney was pretty hands-off with the production. Wong confessed, "We agreed to do the Joy Luck Club on such a low budget that for them, it was a throwaway gamble. And they truly didn't know anything about this type of movie, so they didn't interfere too much."
When I saw the movie, it was so beautifully done that I thought it was a milestone in the public sphere on how Asian American families are represented. It was great. I mean, it was totally transformative for all of us.
So I actually know a few people who work on the film.
Oh, really?
Yes, one of them, I think at the time he was a assistant camera or assistant director. He told me that at the time the entire crew really think it would be the next big thing, not just in terms of like award-winning films, but in terms of like a new direction for mainstream entertainment films. Sadly, that didn't come true, but I think there is still plenty of time for us to look at the film and like, gain a new appreciation for it.
The Joy Luck Club's $10 million budget, while still modest, more than doubled the budget of any of Wong's previous films, and offered him an opportunity to expose the story to a wider audience. I mention all of these details just to convey how in an era with no Asian American movie stars and a long-standing indifference to having them on screen, it's a small miracle that the Joy Luck Club was even made, especially considering a large portion of it isn't in English. And the fact it's become so impactful for Asian Americans makes it a story worth remembering. I think the big thing that makes the Joy Luck Club resonate today is that if you grew up with immigrant parents and family, or even if you're first generation, so many of its story beats and dialogue feel all too familiar.
Should eat more, too skinny.
Well, I thought you said I was getting fat.
It might be pretty normal to see on screen these days, but back then, it was the first time most people had seen an in-depth exploration like this. The film begins in the midst of June's going away party, as she's set to visit China. Several characters at the party belong to the eponymous Joy Luck Club, a weekly meeting first started in China decades ago by Su Yan, June's mother, played by Q Chin, as 4 women gathered to play mahjong, socialize, and enjoy small pleasures to lift their spirits as war with Japan loomed. In present-day America, she restarted the club with fellow immigrant women, and its activities often expanded to include their spouses and children. But Su-yen is notably missing in this opening scene. She'd passed away a few months prior. In this setting, one by one, we're introduced to everyone's past through flashbacks and the ways their experiences branch out and intertwine. For the sake of avoiding confusion, I'll focus on one mother-daughter pairing at a time, though many of the issues in their relationships overlap. June, played by Ming-Na Wen, is tasked with taking Su-yen's place at the mahjong table, a position she doesn't feel equipped for a multitude of reasons.
In me, they see their own daughters, just as ignorant of all the hopes and dreams our mothers brought to this country.
She feels she failed to live up to her mother's lofty expectations, her grades, her career, her love life. This sort of conflict has become par for the course in Asian American stories, a pretty classic dynamic of parents putting pressure on their kids to succeed.
My mother's version of believing in me was believing that I could be anything she wanted.
Su-yen was doing that thing a lot of parents do, using their kids to compete with each other. Her friend Lindo's daughter is a chess champion, and Su-yen wants to raise a prodigy of her own. But June is not a prodigy. She's average, and so are her ambitions and desires, something that's almost inconceivable for people like us, both inside and outside our homes.
I drive my boys to be the best. Jessica, don't raise mediocre.
I have never, ever heard my dad say the word proud. It's always like, that's it?
There was a lot of stereotypes that were put into place for people that look like me, and I felt like I was put in a box. Like I had to be smart, I had to be well-versed on these kinds of things, and I just wasn't like that.
The expectations placed upon children, like this expectation to be really good in school and all that, I totally had that as well.
There's a misperception that, we have this thing called the model minority, that Asians somehow are held up as the standard, right. And the circumstances are different for each group, and so it's hard to make those comparisons. It's unfair to make those comparisons.
Not gonna lie, I was surprised to see pushback against the model minority myth even in the early 90s. The idea that Asian people are inherently the smart and well-behaved minority is of course commonly challenged today, especially considering that, as I mentioned in another video, the concept largely gained traction in response to the civil rights movement to further pit groups against each other. Though the stereotype also didn't materialize from thin air.
Immigration law relaxation 1960s allowed a huge influx of professional Asians into this country. So in a way, the American perception of Asian immigrants became much more positive.
Everything had to be the best. I was the biggest disappointment in my mother's life.
As adults, we might look at this situation and think she probably just wants what's best for her kid. But from June's point of view, her mom's ambitions for her are rooted in a competition to save face, to have the best daughter instead of what she actually got. It's just one example within a pattern of miscommunication.
My mother and I never really understood one another. We translated each other's meanings, and I seemed to hear less than what was said, while my mother heard more.
So June lashes out via self-sabotage, purposefully putting in minimal effort.
I used to go out of my way to prove my mother wrong, that I wasn't cut out to be the best anything.
It leads to a humiliating recital, after which June believes she's free to do what she likes, having completed her mission to be a hopeless disappointment her mother could simply discard. But Su-yen wouldn't give up so easily.
It's a lot about, oh, this person is telling me what to do, and I just don't want to do it. And then, you make all these mistakes, and you're just like, oh, I will purposely not give you the satisfaction of being what you want me to be. A lot of us do have to go down that road of rebellion to establish that sort of independence. And that is also why, June is often that character that so many Asian Americans are like, okay, I get her.
There's a type of pressure to be something and to be kind of important and to be successful, like to bring success to your family. But I also think that there's a degree to which that's toxic for sure, because success is not apolitical. Success is not just this clear, obvious, and pure thing. Success is relative, and it's determined by social expectations that are not very good sometimes.
I understand her insecurities and her worth and all the issues that, she dealt with. And at the end of the day, I think what all these ladies needed really was just their mom's validation. And it's funny because that, I feel like for a lot of us folks, it's very difficult to get that validation from our parents. So
oh my god, yeah. It might even be just a general thing, but maybe maybe a whole Asian American dynamic, but I definitely related to that.
So.
I think this is why I felt such a kinship with June while reading and watching the Joy Luck Club. I've also been but a pawn in my mom's wars against my aunties, with the pressure to become a lawyer or a doctor, and I've also sabotaged myself in a similar way. Don't ask how my Vietnamese spelling bee went. But even if there's a certain satisfaction in rebellion, it's often laced with remorse, the profound shame that comes with letting your parents down. Many of us crave our parents' acceptance. It's the heart of the plot for so many of our films and shows.
We have sacrificed everything for you.
Not only do we feel we owe our elders for their sacrifice and that our struggles are trivial compared to what they've been through, but we're taught that family, blood ties, is the most important thing in our lives, to the point we should always set aside our individual desires. We are but an extension of the family unit and should act accordingly.
Finish your coffee, I told her yesterday. Don't throw your blessings away. Don't be so old-fashioned, Ma, she told me, finishing her coffee down the sink. I'm my own person. And I think, how can she be her own person? When did I give her up?
因为你把生命看成是个体的，东方人是把生命看作是集体的，家庭、社会。
I feel in the West, there's often a misinterpretation of this sort of collectivist worldview. It's not simply a neglect of individual needs, but more of an emphasis on shared responsibility and maintaining a sense of tight-knit community, especially through difficult times. I don't believe families should necessarily dictate every aspect of your life, but I do feel their input and experience have value.
My heritage includes my parents' struggles, their tragedies, their views on morality tempered by circumstances, and what's important. Family is the most important. And you must never be complacent or follow what is popular and only temporary. When times are good, everyone is there for you. When times are bad, only family and true friends remain.
June wants to accept being ordinary and for her mother to accept her as she is, but Su Yen seems reluctant. She still tells everyone her daughter's working on a PhD, even though she's very much not.
I'm just sorry that you got stuck with such a loser. That I've always been so disappointing.
That was the night in the kitchen that I realized I was no better than who I was. I was very good at what I did, succeeding at something small. I no longer felt angry at Waverly. I felt tired and foolish, as if I'd been running to escape someone chasing me, only to look behind and discover there was no one there.
Only hoping best for you. Every time you hoped for something I couldn't deliver, it hurt.
We look at that and say to ourselves, like, oh, we have to be the bad Asian in order to be an individual, like seen as my own person. And then it all comes around in the end when you understand, like, okay, you know, there's a lot of these narratives that have been lying to you, that don't allow you to be your own individual self, that just being authentic is the greatest form of rebellion to any system that there could be.
I'll never be more than what I am, and you never see that, what I really am.
But we have to ask, did June really fail her mother? It's a narrative she assumes, but over time she comes to understand she didn't really know what was going on in her mom's head.
I didn't know anything about her. She was
me.
June only has a vague impression of her mother's life in China. Much like all of the mothers, Su Yen tried to pass down lessons through anecdotes from her own life, but the experiences came off like tall tales, the details changing every time. In all her retellings of the Joy Luck Club's formation, she only offered half-truths about when she fled just before the arrival of Japanese forces. But these skewed renditions don't come from a place of deception or distrust. In the paper Memory and the Ethnic Self, Ben-Su describes why she distorted the events of her past. What we will find with the Joy Luck Club mothers is what Nietzsche calls memory of the will, an active memory that is sustained by the will to survive. Su Yen told her refugee story in so many varied ways that her daughter does not know how to relate them to reality and can only take them as a Chinese fairy tale. These stories, in the form of memory, test Su Yen's ability to forget. These stories are her symptomatic records of a traumatized soul, making a desperate effort to push back the memory of her tragic loss. The real memory was suppressed, but did not go away, and Su Yen, as her second husband feels intuitively, was killed by her own thoughts, which she could not even articulate to her husband and daughter. One day when June is a child and sulking about some minor thing, Su Yen pivots from her normally happy endings, revealing she had a husband in China before meeting June's father, and also twin babies she was forced to leave behind.
She would only say by the time she reached Chungking, she had lost everything. And I said, wait, what happened to those babies?
In the present day, they're celebrating June's upcoming trip to finally meet her half-sisters. It's bittersweet news since they were found only after Suyin passed away. But the aunties bestow upon June the responsibility of going to China to meet them and tell them about their mother, including her death.
They think that she's still alive?
But we'll get back to June later. Meanwhile, Waverly and Lindo's story presents a similar but opposite problem, conveying how the effort to please your parents can become something of a never-ending task. Waverly, played by Tamlin Tamita, is the embodiment of the successful children of immigrants, who get the respected high-paying jobs their parents dream of, but still feel inadequate all the same. Even with so much to be proud of, she's at the mercy of her mother's criticisms, constantly stressing about what Lindo might disapprove of or find flaws in.
This not so good.
My mother, she had been my ally. She'd been the one who protected me the most and taught me these strengths. And she was also my enemy, in a strange way. She was the one who could wound me with any little thing she would say. Oh, not so good, or you should have practiced, why did you get an A-? I could never satisfy her. I could never, meet her expectations, so why should I even try?
Waverly was a chess prodigy as a child. Her mother, played by Sai Chin, boasted about her accomplishments constantly, even taking credit for her strategies, much to Waverly's annoyance.
I told my daughter, use your horse to run over the enemy. You run very quickly this way.
I was like, oh my gosh, I feel like Waverly, especially the expectations, that the parents have and all the competitiveness. My mom showed off about my grades all the time. She's disappointed I didn't become the doctor that she wanted me to be, but...
It culminates in a nasty argument, after which Waverly abandons chess in hopes of getting her mother to beg her to continue.
Did you hear what I said?
But for months on end, Lindo doesn't react at all.
I've decided to play chess again. You think it is so easy? One day quit, next day play.
She eventually continues playing chess on her own accord, but finds she can no longer play at the same level, causing her to dramatically lose faith in herself and continually seek her mother's approval.
What she said, it was like a curse. This belief in myself, I could actually feel it draining away.
By the end of the story, I was practically crying because I realized that although it was fiction, it was the closest thing of describing my life. These things that my mother had taught me that were inexplicable, or this rebellion that I had, and then feeling I had lost some power, lost her approval, and then lost what had made me special.
I could feel myself becoming so ordinary.
This sense of loss and need for approval never really went away for Waverly, even extending to who she dates. Having already gone through a divorce, Waverly is yet to reveal her new engagement to her family, dreading what her mother would say. When she introduces her fiancé at a family dinner, he leaves a memorable first impression.
All this needs is a little soy sauce.
It's a scene that's so subtly mortifying and disastrous that most of the people I talked to brought it up.
Her daughter brings home the white boyfriend, and she goes, he has so many spots on his face.
So many spots on his face.
I cackled.
He should have taken only a small spoonful of the best dish until everyone had had a helping.
You had no kind of understanding of the customs of how to dine with Waverly's mother.
And then he makes the remark that the food's too salty, or the food could use more salt, and insults the mom.
He's not following any tradition.
As is the Chinese cook's custom, my mother always insults her own cooking.
And he's supposed to say, no, it's great, but and me with a mom just like that, I was like, he's done. He's done for her.
Yeah, it's over. Linda was kind to still accept him after that blunder.
That scene is so satisfying. There's this guy pouring soy sauce over this woman's family recipe. Finally, you're stepping into our house, and this is how you act. There's such a lack of respect that so many people have, and I just felt like that was so, after years of people saying our food is weird, our mannerisms are weird, we're rude or whatever, we're kind of finally saying okay, you should look inward.
You don't know the power you have over me. One word from you, and I'm 4 years old again, crying myself to sleep. I'm just so sick of being perfect. I'm never gonna be good enough for her.
Buy one for me and your mom, okay?
Well, I paid off your mortgage, remember?
As described by Nasrullah Mambrol's critical analysis of the Joy Luck Club, none of the daughters speak directly to her mother through her story. These second-generation Chinese American women are convinced that their mothers are irrevocably disappointed in them, and certain that nothing they do will ever win maternal approval or praise, and they are hesitant to confess to their mothers the stories of their insecurities, their failed relationships, their fears about the future. In their narratives, shaped as internal monologues, the daughters document the emotional and psychological conflicts in which they wrestle daily, and they give voice to their emotional estrangement from their mothers, to whom they dare not say what is truly in their hearts. Like with all the daughters, and maybe many of us, Waverly never knew the intimate details of her mother's experience in her home country. When Linda was a child, she was betrothed to a boy from a wealthy family, facing a life of servitude to her new husband and demanding mother-in-law, who expected her to bear children right away. The book makes note that Lindo's experience was becoming uncommon at the time, particularly in urban areas, but the so-called backwards families in the country were always the last to give up stupid, old-fashioned customs.
I began to cry and thought bitterly about my parents' promise. I wondered why my destiny had been decided, why I should have an unhappy life so someone else could have a happy one.
When a woman marries her husband, she leaves her natal family, and then she goes and lives with her husband's family. In that move, she has given up her stature. She enters that family in the lowest rung in the family dynamic. So these girls who are given away are completely at the mercy of the people who adopt them.
In her desperation, she devises a scheme to convince her mother-in-law that the ancestors were unhappy with the marriage. This clever thinking liberated her from a lifetime of unhappiness. Years later, when she witnessed Waverly excel in a game that required such cunning, she saw herself in her daughter's accomplishments. It reminded Linda of her own cleverness and strong will, which is why she was so proud to have passed these traits on. But Waverly didn't see it that way.
If you want to show off, then why don't you learn to play chess?
Waverly spent so much time agonizing over what would make her mother happy, when in reality, she was already everything Linda wanted in a daughter. But the irony is that they both had this misunderstanding about each other.
Embarrassing.
What?
That's all.
Embarrassed you be my daughter?
That's not what I said.
I could see her face looking at me, but not seeing me. She was ashamed to be my daughter.
Generational divides obviously happen across all cultures, but here there's the added layer of the immigrant story, of being raised in a completely different place, with different languages, geopolitical circumstances, and social customs, which can all combine to form a jagged disconnection.
You think American dream is doing just about whatever you want and not thinking about other people? You're wrong.
I mean, I didn't think you were someone who believed in therapy.
I don't. It's for white people.
What about his family? This is America, Ma. No one cares.
We care.
I wanted my children to have the best combination: American circumstances and Chinese character. How could I know these two things do not mix?
The Joy Luck Club is told from the perspective of Asian American women, and much of the story seems tailored for an American audience. The everyday struggles of the American-born daughters make them relatable to perhaps a younger audience, while the stories of hardship in China recontextualize the mothers as more than caricatures. But in comparison, the issues the daughters face feel like such first-world problems. They're often shown to be no different than any other Western woman in the early 90s, which I think is a result of the novel being based on Amy Tan's experiences.
Did I feel that I was insufficient as a Chinese person? Yes, I did. In fact, I didn't speak that much Chinese. I didn't know that China was even in World War II. I knew very little, and part of it was my parents didn't want to tell me anything, and that I wasn't interested because I wanted to be as American as possible, and that made me different to know that.
One interaction that stuck out to me was when another daughter, Rose, played by Rosalind Chow, meets her new boyfriend's affluent family. His mother assures her they're a liberal family.
I would have voted for Obama for a third term if I could.
But suggests that people of a different standard at their company won't be quite as understanding.
How unpopular Vietnam was. I'm not Vietnamese, I'm American.
What are you actually talking about? You could have corrected her, been like, same continent, different countries, different languages, different Western war crimes done to us at different points, you know. And that was really the main issue I had with the film, where I could really tell, okay, this is not my generation. The daughters, especially that one right there, have internalized racism, but the movie never addresses that. The movie never gets to the root of that in a meaningful way where we're going, let's unpack that and let's have some sort of growth from that.
In the novel, Rose says something similar to her own mother.
"He is American," warned my mother, as if I'd been too blind to notice. A Weigerin. "I'm American too," I said.
Weigerin roughly translates to foreigner. More specifically, it means something along the lines of not one of us. Rose aligns herself with her boyfriend, indirectly implying she's also not part of the us her mom is talking about. At the same time, her interaction with his mother highlights her status as a perpetual foreigner, emphasizing the isolating feeling of being alienated from her Chinese heritage, while also dealing with the daily reminder that she's still viewed as an outsider in America. Through this scene, the Joy Luck Club touches on the complex nature of assimilation. There's a few layers of significance to this, since Asian Americans in this cultural climate constantly had to prove their Americanness, which often necessitated shedding pieces of our heritage to further assimilate to dominant society. This could entail anything from simply bringing American food for lunch or going by an English name. There was a yearning to be recognized as something other than an outsider, to be seen as American first.
He's American. Oh, I've got news for you, Mom. I'm American, Eric is American, even Stuart is American.
Even though Davy was Indian, she didn't think of herself as Indian like these girls.
Mom, no. I don't want Chinese lunch. I want white people food.
The kids at school will get used to it.
I still was educated on culture. I went to temple. But like that to me, I was like, why am I doing this? Like kids in my school don't have to do this. Like, why should I have to do it? I don't want to learn. Like, I just want to fit in and be American and dress white for some reason. But now I'm kind of like, why'd I do that?
While Lindo says her daughter should put her feelings behind her face to essentially wear a mask, to an extent there is a mask Waverly's put on her whole life, just not the exact kind Lindo's familiar with. In Memory and the Ethnic Self, it's noted that the daughters, unlike their mothers, are American not by choice but by birth. Neither the Chinese nor the American culture is equipped to define them except in rather superficial terms. They can identify themselves for sure neither as Chinese nor American. Even when they feel their identity of Americanness is an estrangement from their mother's past, there is no means of recovering the Chinese innocence, of returning to a state which their experiential existence has never allowed them. They are Chinese Americans whose Chineseness is more meaningful in their relationship to white Americans than in their relationship to the Chinese culture they know little about. This confusing dichotomy reinforces the notion that you have to be one or the other, but there's no winning.
Quite frequently in my own channel, I get accused by non-Chinese people for being too Chinese, and I get accused by Chinese people for being too white. I'm very literal sandwiched between two different cultures, and neither of them wants me.
There's always like these lists of requirements, right, that you need to check off. You need to speak the language, you need to have grown up directly in the culture, or believe in these ideologies, or believe in these things. In reality, that doesn't change the way that we're viewed by outsiders and how we experience the countries where we grow up in.
There's an identity crisis. So for all of our interviews, my interns would ask them, how do you identify yourself? And so even with third generation people who are interviewed, they still struggle with that. And am I now abandoning all of my past to really become an American?
At the heart of the story is the search for common ground between generations. The novel and film were an avenue for Asian Americans to see themselves in a way we never had the opportunity to, but it also highlighted the need to understand the people who raised us. While there was a longing to be understood and valued in American society, there's also a longing from the parents of Asian Americans to be understood by their children.
I once sacrificed my life to keep my parents' promise. This means nothing to you because to you promises mean nothing. A daughter can promise to come to dinner, but if she has a headache, if she has a traffic jam, if she wants to watch a favorite movie on TV, she no longer has a promise.
It's different from the parents to the children, you know, like usually with the children, it's more like trying to acclimate to this culture that they grew up in, but having it clash with the upbringing of their parents and the parents having to deal with that. With the parents, it's different. It's more like most of the time they're trying to find a better life. So it's mostly like the struggle of trying to make it for their children for a better future.
In their case, I think they didn't want to fit. They wanted to like save their culture and cherish it because that's all they really had. And also kind of like being scared of losing that. You know, if you don't teach your kids what you grew up with, they're not going to really have that.
There is one thing I think the film does very well that very few quote-unquote Asian representation films have done. It focuses much more on the impact of immigration and also reflects on the daughter's either reluctance or willingness to reconnect with the roots, especially in situations where the parents are not willing to do so.
I can speak from experience as the only child of Vietnamese immigrants. My parents had me late in their lives, which only added to the generational disconnect with the huge age gap. My mom raised me on her own after they divorced. So even though I'm not a woman, the complicated parent-child relationships in the Joy Luck Club deeply resonated with me. Yeah, I'm a mama's boy, whatever. Still, our relationship was muddled by these divides. My first language was Vietnamese, but it became a language I only spoke at home. And as I got older, I realized that while my emotions and self-expression grew more nuanced, how I spoke with my mom stayed the same. Conveying my feelings always seemed to translate to childish words in Vietnamese. I just didn't have the vocabulary to properly express myself. The depth of my thoughts in English would get washed away, and only a bitter fragment of the original sentiment remained.
No talking in Chinese. How do I know you're not cheating?
My parents moved from Philippines to all these different places. So I grew up in Hong Kong and then eventually moved to Australia. All that time, I thought, oh, no problem, no big deal, because it was my first language. I can just switch back like that. And then I realized, oh my God, I can't speak it anymore. I can no longer converse or like come up with sentences as easily as I thought.
I really wanted to assimilate because, you know, we're kids. That's kind of all we know how to do. But yeah, now I'm kind of like, there's so much that I want to learn, and I never learned Hindi, and I do want to learn it now.
I can understand how language and experiential differences cause this dilution of emotions for myself, but it was easy to forget my mother's perspective. When she speaks English, there's a visible struggle to relay her thoughts. But in Vietnamese, she has to water down her words in a way I can understand, stripping them of the depth she'd otherwise easily be able to convey. It's a strange feeling trying to talk to someone with a face just like yours, maybe even a common tongue, but still feel you're oceans apart. Simple misunderstandings led to lasting impressions we carried for years, without realizing just how much we misconstrued each other's words. There's a certain grace we want, but can't always receive from our parents, but it's one we don't always give either.
Dad, I'm playing my game.
What did you do when you were growing up in Taiwan?
I worked very hard.
You only visit when you need something.
The daughters in the Joy Luck Club grow up never truly knowing the extent of their mother's hardships and how these experiences shaped them, and therefore aren't really able to appreciate the words of wisdom their mothers offer. Tan has commented on this dynamic.
Their relationships are fraught with years of misunderstandings and accumulated pain. A mother's hopes and expectations become a daughter's sense of failure. A mother's advice is received by a daughter as rejection of who she really is. The mother, in return, feels her daughter knows nothing about her and has learned nothing from her mother, the one who loved her best.
Lindo finally shares the story about her mother, who was forced to give her up. In return, Waverly opens up about her own inner turmoil.
Why don't you like Rich?
Lindo explains her bluntness is how she shows she cares.
So many spots on his face. If I don't like him rich, I act polite, say nothing, let him have big cancer.
I think it says a lot that they only look at each other in the mirror and not directly in the eye. Sometimes you need this sort of indirect barrier to really be able to connect. Lindo and Waverly discover just how alike they are, realizing they both hold their mother's words with great reverence.
And really, I did understand finally what had been true all along. I saw what I had been fighting for. It was for me, a scared child, who had run away a long time ago to what I had imagined was a safer place. And hiding in this place, behind my invisible barriers, I knew what lay on the other side. Her sight attacks, her secret weapons, her uncanny ability to find my weakest spots. But in the brief instant that I had peered over the barriers, I could finally see what was really there. An old woman, a wok for her armor, a knitting needle for her sword, getting a little crabby as she waited patiently for her daughter to invite her in.
I think that was the first real conversation that these two ladies had. I think that one scene for me really stood out because I think it encompassed a lot of that.
In the end, there's always like that very honest moment where we might have a conversation that's like, okay, I want you to be happy and stand in your own power. Maybe I didn't know how to communicate that, but that's what I wanted. And I think that we don't understand that from our parents' point of view. We do come from different cultures, and there is so much that is lost in translation. The ways that we show love, the ways that we show understanding, compassion, empathy, safety, and comfort. I don't think that those values are necessarily expressed in the same exact way.
I really do appreciate the Joy Luck Club's willingness to show that our Chinese ancestry has a different set of culture, has different set of value, has different sets of social problems we faced. If Joy Luck Club came out today, I still don't think it would do too well because the world is not ready to see a Chinese American story depicted with such fervent love for the Chinese identity, that the dialogues are written in a Chinese theater-esque style, that it refers to a Chinese idiom, a goose feather.
This feather may look worthless, but it comes from afar and carries with it all my good intentions.
That's a famous Chinese idiom, and they just take it and put it in the film and be proud of it. They don't have to explain that, oh, hey, this is our culture. It should be part of American culture. These people has been living in America for hundreds plus years now. It's not important to leave this part of the ancestry out of the film or to make a distinction between the two.
But this willingness to include certain cultural elements rubbed some people the wrong way, as some felt the Joy Luck Club was leaning too much into a cliched Western gaze. Before I continue, I want to take some time to talk about today's sponsor, Squarespace. I've never been great with technology, and the idea of building a website used to sound completely outside the realm of what I'm capable of as a person. But using Squarespace was refreshingly intuitive, and it's actually kind of fun to tinker with the designs and find a presentation that works with your style. You can choose from any of their flexible, professional, and sleek templates, and work from there, or start from scratch if you prefer. The design system lets you drag and drop and customize in a ton of different ways, and you can add all sorts of helpful pages and features to make it simple to navigate. Squarespace has all the tools you need to make your website work for you, whether you're showing off a portfolio, promoting an event or personal brand, or selling a product or service. I highly recommend trying it out. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/qualityculture to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring. Now back to the video.
I think in my senior year, my teacher did tell us that the book wasn't received very well by a lot of Asian American audiences, specifically like Chinese American audiences, because of how it did play into stereotypes about mysticism.
The Joy Luck Club is remembered as a celebration of Asian identity, particularly Chinese identity. But to be frank, a lot of people hate the book and movie. The image it carved out felt incomplete to some and wholly inauthentic to others, and many have turned on it in the decades since its release. In particular, some critics call it Orientalist, depicting Asian culture via surface-level imitation catering to Western colonialist biases, like playing into the notion Eastern societies are mystical, mysterious, archaic, and underdeveloped, especially in comparison to the West. One critique remarked, "The American-born daughters, who were eager to be assimilated to the white middle-class American culture, were promoted to the center, while the Chinese mothers represented the other, Chinese culture." In addition, this movie further associated specific values with each culture. The American culture was linked to freedom and humanism, whereas Chinese culture was connected to abuse, coercion, and irrationality. Through this type of articulation, the movie constructed the dichotomy between the humane self and the sexist, oppressive, mysterious, inscrutable, exotic, and savage cultural/racial other. To be fair, it's not easy to represent the customs and traditions of an entire country, especially one as vast and diverse as China, and especially when the narrative context often involves fleeing from war or poverty. None of these places, let alone Asia as a whole, are cultural or socio-economic monoliths, though telling stories to a foreign audience often necessitates a flattening of their many components into baser elements, which can make it come off hollow to those more intimately familiar with specific qualities and distinctions.
China has like over 50 ethnic minorities, Han being the majority, and Han culture is what's exported to the rest of the world as well. It's really hard that it's kind of like has to be reduced down, like it's like playing a game of telephone. Like there is like an origin of all of these traditions, but every time it gets passed down, it gets tweaked a little changed, and then it becomes like just this overall generalization.
If I saw a movie that portrayed the Philippines in that way, would I find it offensive or would I find it too stereotypical? I guess I would say it seemed like they focused a little too much on the negative, it seemed. Every time they showed some Chinese tradition, it was always like this is like this mystical thing, and it kind of like backwards or whatever, or exotic, you know?
If there's anything to that criticism, there's not the same type of critical lens put on the American characters and even like American cultural stuff as there is towards Chinese characters and Chinese cultural stuff. The way that they were so backwards in China, we had to escape to America to get a better life. And that is a reality of immigration, but there's not much depicted in terms of why that reality was the way it was and how it ended up. What you end up with when you watch the movie, if you're not critical or like understanding of the subtext, is a sense that, well, now that we've gotten to America and gotten with some white people, everything is better now. The only thing we got to do is like, just get more of these Chinese people over to America then. This is the place where hope is and good things are.
One of the Joy Luck Club's most ardent critics was Frank Chin. I want to preface by saying Chin was deeply invested in showcasing three-dimensional Asian American experiences. He was a pioneer of Asian American theater and dedicated his career trying to craft an image of identity that was more true to life than the stereotypes he'd grown up seeing. So I don't want to downplay his impact and dedication to the culture. But the guy was pretty willing to tear down other Asian American writers for what he felt was a pattern of misappropriation in Asian American literature. In a very critical article called "Come All Ye Asian American Writers of the Real and the Fake," he specifically pointed to Amy Tan as a perpetrator of Asian stereotypes. Writing, Amy Tan opens her Joy Luck Club with a fake Chinese fairy tale about a duck that wants to be a swan, and a mother who dreams of her daughter being born in America, where she'll grow up speaking perfect English and no one will laugh at her, and where a, quote, woman's worth is not measured by the loudness of her husband's belch. The fairy tale is not Chinese, but white racist. It is not informed by any Chinese intelligence. This is Confucian culture, as seen through the interchangeable Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese mix, depending on which is the yellow enemy of the moment of Hollywood. Chin's harsh critiques are in part a reaction to a history of flawed representation. In his eyes, certain works seem to insist that Asian culture was inferior to America and the West. It's not an entirely invalid issue regarding Joy Luck, as the daughters speak about their Chinese heritage with a certain measured distance. They see themselves as socially distinct from their mothers. They're not Chinese, they're American.
They were really saying, I'm not really Chinese, I'm really white. I used to be Chinese, but I was raised in America. Really, I'm white inside. I don't know Chinese. I don't like Chinese. I don't eat Chinese food. I don't go to Chinese school. I don't have Chinese friends. I wish I didn't have Chinese parents. So I'm really 100% American Christian, just like you. It bothered me. It always bothered me. What's wrong with being Chinese?
I think a lot of experts have kind of argued this. It is really complicated because you're dealing with a period piece, right? And so you're dealing with a time that feels further from where we are today. That kind of inherently makes it seem, like it's playing into kind of a white gaze when it kind of does depend on who you ask.
The question of authenticity has always been a topic of discussion regarding Asian American stories. Even Flower Drum Song wasn't exactly a hit with many Chinese Americans. They found the film distasteful, with stereotypes ranging from its oversimplified, happy-go-lucky depiction of Chinatown, the objectification and exoticization of Asian women, and messaging about the benefits of assimilation. And also yet another actor in yellowface. In 2002, David Henry Hwang reimagined the musical for a return to Broadway, admitting the original held an outsider's point of view of Chinatown. In discussing what compelled him to revive the show, what stuck out to me was how he described seeing Asian characters on screen as a child. Writing, as a young Chinese American growing up in Los Angeles in the 1960s, I would go out of my way not to watch movies or television shows featuring Asian characters. If asked to explain, I might simply have replied that they made me feel icky. They were consistently inhuman, either inhumanly bad or inhumanly good. Reading Huang's words reawakened feelings I'd long forgotten. The dread of anticipating what kind of joke would be made at an Asian character's expense, knowing that all of my friends would see these caricatures when they looked at me. But even when Asian characters weren't a joke, like Huang mentioned, they just never seemed to feel like actual people, at least not in the way characters of other ethnicities were capable of being. Still, Huang was also a target of Chin's criticisms. While these stories are often cited as the foundation of Asian American literature, he saw them as an affront to it, as they so often seem to despise their roots. He essentially asked, how can you claim to write a story about valuing yourself when you make a mockery of the culture you pretend to uplift?
Screw the pioneers. What have the old pioneers ever done for us?
To put it another way, he believed all of these authors were Uncle Wongs, who were only successful because they bowed to the preconceived ideas of white racists. Kingston, Huang, and Tan are the first writers of any race, and certainly the first writers of Asian ancestry, to so boldly fake the best known works from the most universally known body of Asian literature and lore in history. And to legitimize their faking, they have to fake all the Asian American history and literature, and argue that the immigrants who settled and established Chinese America lost touch with Chinese culture, and that a faulty memory combined with new experience produced new versions of these traditional stories. This version of history is their contribution to the stereotype.
It's not just leaning into this exotic Chinese identity to attract a white audience. It's not quite that, because when I actually pay attention to like the costumes, the Chinese text, the dialogues, the historical period accuracy, all of them are sublime. They are very well done. We see in the background like the invading Japanese forces, and there's a banner. It's small, it's on screen for like 5 seconds, and it's accurate to the period. Like detail this small is accurate is the reason that makes me give this film a lot of benefit of the doubt. It makes me re-examine the film in a way that I want to guess what the filmmaker's intentions are.
And we have to understand this is a movie from 1993. And if you look at other works that were coming out in 1993 with all the horrible racist jokes and things like that and horrible depictions in Western media, I mean, this is miles ahead of all that. I will say, yeah, it's dramatic. It can be subtle too. We can also get the point across in subtle ways, but I think being one movie in that time and nothing else, I feel like maybe it had to be a little loud in its themes to get these points across.
I'm Japanese, I'm not Chinese. I get why some people get worried and defensive about, oh, it's the one movie and people are gonna assume that's what everyone is like. And I'm not saying that those feelings are invalid, but also just if people are gonna be stupid, just tell them they're being stupid.
To be fair, some of the scenes and dialogue in the Joy Luck Club do come off a little melodramatic in a sort of mystical way.
Like a tiger in the trees, ready to leap out and cut a spirit loose.
Then again, plenty of films around that time, especially period pieces, have a similar quality. Yang also noted that a case could be made that the over-the-top theatricality was a deliberate stylistic choice, paying homage to elements of Chinese theater.
I was taken back at first by how the language was written in a way that feels surreal. Like it's not how normal people speak. It's very theatrical, very poetic in a way. Ironically, this is a very Chinese way of writing dialogues for a theater performance. The emotion continues to be heightened, and there's a lot of subtext on stage, very coded. The filmmaker essentially took that format and put it into this film, which is why everybody speaks in a way that's very announcing their emotions, or saying things that are very metaphorical. From the surface, yeah, it seems like it leans into that Orientalist, like, oh, Asian people speaks differently, they are very wise. But in truth, this is just how Chinese theaters feel.
There are some pretty sad stories, and there are Chinese operas of these stories, Chinese lore. You have to remember, Amy wrote this 3 decades or 2 decades ago when it was very difficult to introduce these systems and these implications of the system to a Western audience. She had to be very strategic. I think there was definitely some Orientalist tendencies, but I think at the time we were so grateful. There was even a story out there about mother-daughters that we tolerated the little bit of Orientalism in the movie, and we figured, at least I figured, that maybe that's the only way you can really get the Western mainstream audience to accept the story, because they needed something that they are familiar with to grab onto.
Chin wasn't wrong in wanting a variety of depictions of Asian American life, but I think he neglected to see past his own experiences as the model for what that should look like. David Henry Hwang said it best when he responded to Chin's criticism, saying, "Frank seems to believe that there is one definition of authentic, his own, and that all others are fake. He also ostensibly believes that root culture traditional material needs to be utilized with absolute felicity to the source material. The reality is, however, that just as different cultures experience different realities, so do individuals within these cultures. No one has a monopoly on authenticity, not even Frank Chin." I think it's important to apply this context to Amy Tan and the characters in the Joy Luck Club.
You know, it's funny, in Joy Luck Club, I always expected that people in China or other people who spoke Chinese and knew everything would come to me and say, "That's not how it was at all."
Many of us don't have direct experiences with Asian culture outside of our immediate family, so it can be easy to misconstrue things and view them through an American lens. Interestingly enough, it's a dilemma directly addressed in the text. Lindo's own daughter makes her feel othered, as if she's a clueless foreigner.
Isn't that right, Ma? Why does my daughter think she's translating English for me?
A passage from the book notes her frustration with Waverly's condescension.
Why do you always tell your friends that I arrived in the United States on a slow boat from China? I was not that poor. I took a plane. Why do you always tell people that I met your father in a Chinese restaurant that only non-Chinese people actually went to? Now it is a McDonald's restaurant with a big Chinese sign that is all nonsense. Why are you attracted only to Chinese nonsense? You must understand my real circumstances.
It reveals Tan's self-awareness about some of the gaps in knowledge about her culture that I don't think Chin really considers in his criticisms. Within the novel, separate characters even mention how embracing Chinese culture is becoming fashionable. There's an air of annoyance from Lindo, as she feels her daughter's only interested in her heritage because it's now deemed acceptable by Americans. It was part of a burgeoning cultural shift Dr. Chow largely attributed to political and economic factors.
I think it has to do with the geopolitical balance in the world. The minute China started rising, if you will, becoming a much more powerful force economically, first of all, and now politically, the entire Western attitude toward Asians and Chinese, whether it's in this country or in Asia, changed. The Chinese population has huge purchasing power. They also have stronger cultural influence. And now the American society has to basically sit up and listen. I think that's when the attitude changed. So it started in the 1980s and 1990s.
Tan was clearly cognizant of these shifting perceptions about Chinese Americans and how it affected their self-perceptions. Additionally, there's also a crucial aspect often overlooked in the Orientalist criticism. Most of the plot points are taken directly from Tan's real-life family history, women's traumatic experiences, belief in superstition and the supernatural, the emotional trip to China, even the titular club itself.
There really was a Joy Luck Club. And it was a group of Chinese friends who had immigrated to this country, and they got together about once a month, and they played mahjong, and they played cards, and they cooked Chinese food at midnight, and all kinds of goodies. And we kids would be there during part of it, just listening. So we grew up Joy Luck. That's very ordinary words to me.
Tan grew up in the Bay Area in the 50s, in a predominantly white suburb, causing her to lack a strong sense of connection to her heritage. And her relationship with her mother Daisy was complicated, to say the least.
Don't let a boy kiss you, because if you do, maybe you can't stop. And then you have a baby, and you're so ashamed you put baby in the garbage can. And then police come get you, put you in jail rest of your life. Might as well just kill yourself right now. At the time, I didn't yet know about my mother's arranged marriage to an abusive man, or that her mother had been raped and forced to become a concubine, or that her mother later swallowed opium and my mother watched her die. I didn't know so many things that were the reasons for the warnings.
Daisy was captured and assaulted while trying to flee China with her second husband, Amy's father. They reunited in California in 1949, where she intended to send for her 3 daughters, but this never materialized due to the bamboo curtain, which prevented Chinese nationals from leaving the country. She attributed these experiences to a familial curse, a belief that only intensified when Amy's father and brother both succumbed to brain tumors within a 6-month span. Daisy even tried to end her own life a number of times, once threatening Amy with a knife, claiming she'd kill the rest of their family and herself to put an end to the curse.
But I came home one day and she was raging, and she pushed me, and her eyes were glazed, In a way, they were God.
For Tan, this connection to the past and the trickle effect it has on future generations has been an ever-present source of inspiration. It adds a lot of context to the traits and experiences of the mother characters, each possessing a crucial element of her mother. What could be more authentic than that?
I would listen to everything. She loved the idea she was helping me to write.
I think in some ways, to regard the story as pure exotic fantasy for a Western gaze is to deny a harsh reality millions of women have faced throughout history.
Being harsh on the Orientalism, I understand that. I would say it's one story. At the same time, these are not issues that have been created out of the blue. These issues exist, and it's okay to highlight them. And it's okay to, not just think of it like, oh my gosh, my culture is being brought down.
I looked at it as more so period typical sexism, addressing systemic misogyny in general, because there were elements of sexism and misogyny in some of the daughter stories as well.
I think the film does a fair job at portraying China. Ultimately, I think the question is not important because to me, this film isn't about China to begin with. To me, this is very clearly a feminist film. Whether or not it's in China is entirely irrelevant to me. As they immigrated, they brought that baggage with them, and it was reflected on the next generation as they live in America and realizes the problem persisted. It's not as aggressive, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
The older I get, the more I want to know about the women of our family. Within their lives are the reasons I feel compelled to write what I do. I want to know more about the times in which they lived, about the nature of the society that constrained them, about expectations placed on them. I want to know the emotional core of my heritage, because the more I know about them, the more I know about myself.
Although the story obviously has its cultural elements, the Joy Luck Club is undeniably rooted in female identity and connection between women. Like I've mentioned, popular media at the time was highlighting women's voices more and more, becoming open to exploring these themes with all the nuance and gravity that they deserve. And it's been nice to see something of a continuation of that theme in recent years in Asian American projects.
I think that what was cool is that I don't necessarily feel that Asian American women were always allowed to express that. A lot of experts had brought up that this is one of the few times where we can call out the patriarchy. A lot of those think pieces then about what that really meant for, Asian women to say that with their chests.
Women's stories are very important to tell, especially in more marginalized communities because they have a lot to tell. One of the first big representations of South Asians in the West, Mississippi Masala, that was a really interesting perspective to watch because being a South Asian woman in America in the 90s wasn't easy. So kind of highlighting that at that time was pretty revolutionary. You didn't see that.
To get back to the character storylines, a lot of Lena's childhood backstory was cut from the film, so our time with her is pretty brief. I guess all you really need to know is that growing up, her mother was emotionally absent while battling mental illness and inner demons. And Lena, played by Lauren Tom, eventually marries this petty, penny-pinching dude. They met at an architectural firm they both worked at. He was a partner and she was an associate. And she encouraged him to open his own company, which became successful largely because of her ideas and contributions.
We were equals, except that I work in his firm and he pays himself 7 times more than he pays me.
Even with this disparity, he still expects to split their household bills 50-50. Everything down the middle, supposedly.
Magazines I subscribe to, which he reads, but only because they're there.
$41 each.
So what if I had a salad and he had 3 courses? You gave her to me as a birthday gift, and now you want me to pay to get rid of her fleas?
It's not as extreme as some other forms of controlling behavior we've seen in the story, but it highlights yet another way women are often taken advantage of, both personally and professionally. The guy just sucks, and speaks to her in a demeaning way like she's a child.
Lena, when you buy charcoal, you have to buy lighter fluid. Don't you know that yet? Do I have to remind you every time?
I guess kudos to this actor because this character was just the bane of my existence.
What's going on?
So I read a paper by this student named Yongjiang Chen. There are themes that are apparently found in the book that have to do with the types of jobs, for instance, that both Asian men and women immigrants have to take on that is highly demeaning, that is underpaid, and then the ways that the women in turn are paid way less. That's kind of touched on in the movie with the accountant who he's got kind of operating under the guise of equality and fairness with his wife, but he's also basically robbing her of a lot of money for her work and for the, different things that they're accounting for. And also just in general, the position that the woman has in the family, having to be the caretaker, having to be the domestic laborer, taking care of the house, taking care of the needs of the men.
What did you do when you were our age here in New York?
I just worked and took care of you and your father.
Women are taking care of men who are, assuming themselves to be doing the same amount of work, but maybe aren't necessarily. And how men are often taking out their frustrations on women and abusing them in certain ways, even if it's not so clear like as abuse, but like mistreating them or taking them for granted on account of wanting to have that power over somebody.
So Lina feels voiceless and trapped in her marriage. It's no wonder her ugly gray house reminds me of a prison. Her passivity seems to stem from her relationship with her mom, played by France Nguyen. Lina grew up only knowing her mother Ying Ying as this distant, mysterious figure, often bedridden during bouts of severe depression. Not only was Ying Ying taught from a young age to be passive and obedient, but through various childhood experiences, she became obsessed with frightening superstition and the idea that we must resign ourselves to the fate laid out before us. Which is why she ends up marrying this womanizer dude. After they married, he became abusive and openly cheated on her.
He had taken from me my innocence, my youth, my heart.
In the novel, she's pregnant. He leaves her for someone else, and facing the prospect of being a single, penniless mother in 1940s China, she has an abortion. In the film, she drowns her baby in a moment of desperate revenge. I mean, she's haunted by it for a long time, but the movie doesn't dwell on this for long before pivoting back to Lina's marriage troubles. Ying Ying always felt like a shell of a person, and worries she passed on this lack of spirit to her daughter. In their climactic scene, she encourages Lina to take control over her situation, to take advantage of the wisdom she has at her disposal, and not let fate decide.
Losing him does not matter. It is you who will be found.
Meanwhile, Rose is in the midst of a divorce caused by her decreasing self-esteem.
Everything I had married into, the pressure, the weight of it.
She married into this rich, important family, who clearly feels some type of way about her race, and let herself shrink into the background, becoming submissive in her marriage and always bending to the will of others. She wasn't always this way, but now she insists her husband make all the decisions, even for something as simple as what's for dinner.
Over the years, I learned to choose from the best opinions. Chinese people had Chinese opinions, American people had American opinions. And in almost every case, the American version was much better. It was only later that I discovered a serious flaw with the American version. There were too many choices, so it was easy to get confused and pick the wrong thing.
I mean, I'd like to hear your voice, even if we disagree. You used to be different. You used to have an opinion.
She made the entire problem in the marriage. She just out of nowhere is like, I'm gonna lower myself. When he didn't even, I would have been with her if he was the bad guy and he was making her feel some type of way. He literally didn't do that. Or if he did, it wasn't shown in the movie.
She can't speak up for herself for some reason. I don't remember why, but she can't make choices without him and she feels dependent on him.
It's not fleshed out that well, to be honest, but the point is she lost her sense of self-worth.
I like being tragic, Ma. I learned it from you.
Rose's mother, An Mei, played by Lisa Liu, continues to pester her about talking things through with her soon-to-be ex-husband. But it's not until she shares the story of her childhood that Rose truly understands her advice. An Mei's mother was a widow, deceived into being a powerful man's fourth wife, a shameful social status her family ostracized her for.
No one believed she was raped.
Trapped at the bottom of her new family's hierarchy, and with her son taken from her, she only stayed alive for An Mei's sake, committing suicide 3 days before the Lunar New Year to ensure An Mei would have a better life than she did. In Wisdom Unheeded, Chinese Mothers and American Daughters, Rocio Davis argues that An Mei Su learns from her mother's suicide how to use the world for her own advantage. She not only traces how her mother makes the Chinese cultural beliefs work for her, suicide is a way a woman can escape marriage and gain revenge, to come back as a ghost and scatter tea leaves and good fortune. But she also realizes almost immediately the acute significance of the words of her mother, who tells her she, the mother, would rather kill her own weak spirit so she could give me a stronger one. Anmei's sensitivity, characteristic of all the Chinese mothers, towards the things happening around her, coupled with a willingness to accept what could not be seen, permitted a maturity beyond her years and beyond her daughter's reach.
I was taught to desire nothing, to swallow other people's misery.
There's a story of like her not evaluating her self-worth, not valuing herself properly, and it's extremely moving, but there's also a complexity that I think is captured. Where is the line between the sacrifices that I make for other people and pursuing some type of ideal individualized life for myself and valuing myself?
You're just like my mother. Never know what you're worth until too late. If not too late for you.
She tells Rose to recognize her value, and Rose realizes her mother wasn't urging her to cling to her marriage, but to speak up for herself and fight for her and her own daughter's well-being, regardless whether the marriage worked out or not. Rose finds strength in hearing her family's history and the legacy her grandmother left behind.
Maybe it is because she was born to me and she was born a girl. And I was born to my mother and I was born a girl.
Like with Lena and Ying Ying's stories, Rose and Anmei speak to a pattern of voicelessness generations of women have grappled with. Amy Tan touched on this in an interview.
I looked at this picture of my grandmother and I thought, here was a woman who is nearly unknown to everyone in the world except my mother, and she's leaving this world. She was a voiceless woman who killed herself, and this legacy of voicelessness is something she passed on to my mother, and, in a sense, to me.
All of us like stairs, one step after another, always going the same way.
For the women, you're supposed to be obedient, and this is the way you're supposed to act.
Fulfill your duties calmly and respectfully.
There's definitely a double standard I noticed placed upon me and my other female cousins compared to like my male cousins, where we're always expected to dress a certain way. We're not expected to be loud or like be that outspoken. There's like this expectation placed upon us to be pleasant and demure and to not catch so much attention.
One of my big takeaways was just, I really hope like my mom watches the movie one day. And my mom is not Chinese. My mom is 100% Dominican. Her story and like the stories of the women in her life and the sacrifices that they made, even in the second class position that all immigrants have faced, women are like the second class of the second class. It really gives a chance for these women, and this is kind of what the Joy Luck Club represents, right? To tell their stories and to have a kind of safe space, but also kind of the ability to have the microphone, to have the narrative, to talk about all the different ways which they've been silenced essentially and made to sacrifice everything in their own interest for the sake of other people.
Especially as an Asian woman, I think that you move through society kind of being extremely hyper aware of, kind of the patriarchal structure that we kind of live under, because you have that sort of dynamic coming from, our heritage and those cultures, but then you also have the intersection of that from Western cultures. And so it's kind of this like very teeny tiny slice in the Venn diagram where we're allowed to exist. And entertainment experts have always kind of touched on the ways in which Asian women are kind of tossed around in media as, spoils of war, depending on which side you're on, things like that. And it's never really from the perspective of women. And so I think that was so powerful.
I learned to shout.
Within the Joy Luck Club's pages and scenes, there's a narrative trend of women sharing their stories, remembering those that came before them, and learning to take life into their own hands. This would be an ongoing pattern in Tan's other works. In The Bone Setter's Daughter, an immigrant mother shares writings about her past with her daughter so she can better understand her. In The 100 Secret Senses, two sisters, one half Chinese and one fully Chinese, share their stories and contrasting experiences in America and China. In The Kitchen God's Wife, an immigrant mother tells her daughter about her mysterious past, largely based on Amy's mother's life. You get the idea. The success of her debut novel solidified the emotional relevance of this central idea, an exchange of memories and fears to help bridge the gap of understanding.
She and I have shared the same body. There is a part of her mind that is part of mine, but when she was born, she sprang from me like a slippery fish and has been swimming away ever since. All her life, I have watched her as though from another shore, and now I must tell her everything about my past. It is the only way to penetrate her skin and pull her to where she can be saved.
I found, in unearthing all these things, I found poignant things about our relationship, the letters she wrote to me and the letters I wrote to her. I had always thought that we were apart, and what I realized in writing this, that we were almost dangerously like symbiotic twins, that there was almost a pathological need to be within each other's feelings and to understand each other.
As Amy grew older, she learned to recontextualize Daisy's anxieties. She wasn't just an overbearing mom obsessed with ancient curses, but a woman stricken with unfathomable grief and misfortune, desperately clinging to what was left of her family. When a health scare forced Amy to confront how little she knew of her mother, she made a vow to really listen to her as she told her stories, and even take her to China to learn more about her. There, they reunited with the daughter she had to leave behind all those years ago.
You have to have that, form that deep connection with them over time. It takes time, right? Because when you're a kid, you don't understand these things. But then when you grow up and you start to realize, okay, this is why, this is happening, or this is why this expectation is set, and this is where it stems from, then you can sort of address it, in a way that they also will understand. And it's not just you just sort of banging your head against the wall and nobody's listening.
Waverly took best quality crab, you took worst because you have best quality heart.
So why did Soo-yin seemingly put pressure on her daughter to do better? It's of course related to her story as a refugee, and her desire for June to have a comfortable life. The bragging rights were a fun bonus. Sue calls it an expression of her survival instinct. What the mother seeks from her friends and neighbors is not the kind of approval that applauds her daughter's personal qualities, but the conviction of herself that her daughter possesses the attributes of a survivor. The disposition for many first-generation Chinese immigrants in America to see life as a constant test of survival, to the extent that it almost becomes ethnic symbolism, is a complex mentality. It is deeply rooted in China's past of hardship and numerous famines and wars. This is something we can only understand if we truly try to appreciate the stories of the people who came before us, genuinely listening and absorbing the emotional context, rather than just retaining the facts. This is why I am who I am. Please see me the way that I see you.
I see you.
I think that that's one of the most powerful revelations anybody could have, and one of the biggest struggles of life, because we're so caught up in trying to establish our agency, our individuality, making people hear us, that we often lose sight of hearing other people out.
I think that our older generations also deserve that love and that representation and that comfort. This group of women comes together for generations and for years and years, to do this so that they are able to just laugh and love and all these things. I think that is so beautiful. And I love that was the premise with which we explore these different dynamics.
Soo-yin passed away before she could finish telling her story, and maybe she never would have been able to bring herself to finish it anyway.
She almost died, She never told you?
Instead, June's father tells her the rest.
On the day you're born, she transferred all her hope to you.
With a more complete understanding of her mother's life, June fills Soo-yin's place not only at the mahjong table, but her place in her sister's arms.
Yet they still look familiar, and now I also see what part of me is Chinese. It is so obvious. It is my family. It is in our blood. After all these years, it can finally be let go.
What June lets go of isn't just her feelings of inadequacy regarding her disconnection from her family's culture, but the pain her mother kept inside as she mourned the loss of her other children. Now, all of Soo-yin's daughters can carry on their mother's hopes and dreams, together. Joy Luck was instrumental in presenting Asian Americans in a new light, but some people in the community felt left out of the celebration. Along with the Orientalism critique, Asian American men in particular voiced dissatisfaction about the novel and the film, pointing at how Asian women were able to see themselves with nuanced portrayals, while Asian men were depicted as generally unlikable, misogynistic, and at times just straight up evil.
That's not a totally unfair point, because I did notice that myself. The point of the movie is to sort of talk about things from a lens where, okay, this is why these women suffered. And historically, again, not all, I have to say that there's a lot of good men out there, but a lot of these issues occur.
Well, systemic misogyny, it exists, and it's totally valid for Asian women to speak out. If the call is coming from inside the house...
They're complaining because, these films are making men the bad guys. I feel like that's the same argument as like making a film about any, you know, like Asian person, and an encounter with like a person who's racist and they're white, and then white people are like, why are you saying I'm racist? Like, we're not all racist. I'm not the bad guy.
Even now, there's a subsect of men online who seethe about the Joy Luck Club and Amy Tan, describing the story as dangerous and misandrist. I saw one person even sincerely call it Birth of a Nation for Asian Men, which it's not. Come on, y'all. No. But I won't entirely dismiss the overall critique because some of the points being made aren't completely unfounded. Even Wong, who usually laughs off this criticism while citing China's quote, embarrassing macho culture, has remarked he would do things differently and offer a more balanced portrayal.
But I do sympathize with the Asian men, who feel like they aren't represented as well or as frequent as they probably would like to be in media, Hollywood media in particular. So there was one critic who said that usually Asian men in mainstream media, especially at the time, are typically portrayed as like caricatures. Either they're robbed of their masculinity, so they're a character to be mocked, or they're exaggeratedly masculine.
Anna's referring to the 1993 review in the Harvard Crimson, where Alan Soong writes, "While the women in this film are fully fleshed out characters who are a remarkable improvement over the exotic Oriental, the male characters are merely additions to the long list of negative images of Asian men in our culture. Asian men in this film are caricatures who often have less than a page of lines, and who all have the emotional depth of a tree slug." We see small instances of this, like with Lindo's first husband, who, to be fair, is just a kid, though his lies made Lindo take the brunt of his mother's torture, but also more notable and egregious examples like An Mei's mother's rapist husband with 4 wives, and Ying Ying's cartoonishly evil first husband, who might as well have been twirling a mustache the whole time.
Almost like literally acted like a supervillain, the way like he like burst into the door with his mistress and was like, "This is my mistress."
Yes.
It was just like, it was so, you know, like blatant. I thought that they could have done better and could have also offered the same nuance to their male characters as well. That would have made the movie more compelling to me and probably more impactful too.
Like Soong touched on in his 1993 review, parallel with the tropes of the nerdy, sexless Asian guy was the violent, hyper-masculine ass kicker. Sometimes he's Bruce Lee or Jackie Chan, but often he was the criminal poisoning the community, an extension of the yellow peril stereotype, which has existed for as long as Asians have been immigrating to the US.
Congress came down with the 1882 Exclusion Act. There was a Page Act which basically said any Chinese woman immigrating to the US would be considered a prostitute until proven innocent. I mean, it was a pretty draconian law. But then the result is that Chinatown became a ghetto of Chinese bachelors. So then the perception of Chinatown and Chinese is really low, right? These are laborers who gamble, who smoke opium, and there's nothing going on. And then Chinese men were not able to form families because there weren't enough women.
I can see that there might be undertones as well where, especially in the 20th century, late 19th century, a lot of the propaganda about Chinese immigrants and then later Japanese immigrants was a lot of these narratives about them, you know, taking over the world and like abusing their women, which is like a common colonial narrative about the colonized. So those things, I can see how people would have sensitivities to them and then watch a movie like this and feel a bit triggered by some of those depictions.
Not to mention the 1992 LA riots happened just the year prior, with news programs flooded with imagery of armed Asian men. Interestingly, there seemed to be a segment of Asian American men who enjoyed their depiction as violent characters, regardless if they leaned into Orientalist tropes. Even Year of the Dragon, that Oliver Stone film I mentioned earlier, wasn't universally despised in the Asian American community. An article by Frank Wu articulates the sentiment at the time, describing how protests led to the film opening with a disclaimer. So out of curiosity, he went to see it with his Asian American roommates, who, contrarily, admired the macho characters. They thrilled to Joey Tai's cool, a macho version of traditional inscrutability. I suspect Asian American guys are like other guys. They want to identify with a figure who commands respect, gutsy instead of wimpy. They glimpse for a moment what they can revel in, an Asian American who will stare down the bigot who confronts him. Only one of them can remain standing. Those are the rules in the genre of the East, no different than the West. An Asian American punk blows away a white shopkeeper who calls him chink. It would be impolitic to note that the kid is extorting his victim. The characters in Year of the Dragon are unquestionably reprehensible, but I think some Asian American men felt attached to these evil portrayals because of how much they differed from the typical stereotypes. They weren't weak, nerdy, or the butt of the joke, and the violence they enacted wasn't based in martial arts. But ignoring the sector of Asian men who romanticize positions of power at the top of patriarchal hierarchies, we can all agree that wanting to have fully fleshed out Asian male characters is reasonable. And in a way, the Joy Luck Club was hurtful to those who hoped to see themselves with the same depth the female characters had. Furthermore, as Soong briefly mentions in his review, a prominent complaint isn't just that Asian men are shown like this, but that they're depicted as evil, especially in comparison to other male supporting characters.
What I've found more interesting than, saying that, okay, these men are represented badly or this and that, I think it's more interesting that 2 out of the 3 daughters that were married got married to white guys. One white man, I think I could be like, okay, cool, because you're trying to show, okay, these ladies are, expanding and you love who you love and things like that. But 2 out of 3, and then, the one that was Asian was very a stickler for money and things like that. So
it was funny that you mentioned that because that's actually something they changed from the book, because the book, it was all of them. All of them were white.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
In the book, the daughters' partners are all white guys, including Mr. 50-50. And in the movie, while the now Asian husband is, well, like this,
what's going on?
The remaining white husbands are knights in shining armor and or lovable doofuses.
Sorry, Mom, you made a fucking asshole out of yourself in front of the woman I love.
How else would I have known if he hadn't rescued me? How wonderful he was.
Rose even mentions how she was originally attracted to Ted because of how not Asian he was.
I have to admit that what I initially found attractive in Ted were precisely the things that made him different from my brothers and the Chinese boys I had dated. His brashness, the assuredness in which he asked for things and expected to get them, his opinionated manner, his angular face and lanky body, the thickness of his arms, the fact that his parents immigrated from Tarrytown, New York, not Tianjin, China.
Conversely, while Waverly's first husband was Chinese, she admits the marriage was to appease her mother.
I even married a Chinese guy to please her.
And we don't hear much else about him. We do meet her new man, the clueless but ultimately harmless schlub. It calls to mind a social criticism about the frequency of Asian woman-white man pairings. There's a belief that these relationships inherently reflect an underlying self-hatred in Asian women because of the history of Western fetishization and so on.
Like they do that critique in bad faith. A lot of times it ends up in like abuse towards Asian women who date interracially and marry interracially, and just abuse towards Asian women in general. They're race traders and things like this. And these kinds of things have no place in any of our dialogue, any of our discourse about Asian identity.
I want to make it clear that I'd never suggest there's anything wrong with Asian women dating outside their race. People are allowed to consensually date whoever they like. It really doesn't matter as long as they're not actively disparaging other groups in the process. Also, I'm in an interracial relationship, so it'd be weird if I thought otherwise. This commentary necessitates a clear dividing line between real life and how a creator depicts relationships in their art. To conflate the two would be irresponsible and ridiculous. Anyway, the fictional story seems perfectly willing to detail all the indignities imparted at the hands of Chinese men, while presenting the white men in a very forgiving light. Rose even works things out with Ted after his affair. Although I thoroughly enjoyed and was moved by the Joy Luck Club, the contrast between how the men are depicted is hard to ignore. Soong captured my feelings in his review, writing, "I don't believe that a movie shouldn't be seen because it slights or offends someone or some group." And by the end of the movie, I was sniffling pretty hard along with the rest of the crowded house. I'd have to be an insensitive lout not to feel for these mothers and daughters, played extremely well. But there were larger issues raised. Issues I noticed once the pathos had worn off. Don't let me stop you from seeing the Joy Luck Club. Just keep in mind that there are Asians not on the screen who are hurting too, and who have yet to be told they are accepted.
I do think that Asian men's issues get glossed over a lot, especially because a lot of the focus is on, like, at least like in popular culture, like the Chinese American female experience.
I think that I do want to see what that is like for an Asian American man to wrestle with a certain vulnerability. There is still a lot to talk about, when we think about the topic of Asian American masculinity, and it's such a complicated, very fragile topic. I think still to this day, I feel like all my Asian American guy friends, there is this sort of untapped discussion, I guess, and this sort of vulnerability that comes with that topic that I'm like interested in seeing, especially between fathers and sons.
I mean, it did not paint a flattering picture of Asian men. But
Yeah.
that's because she was critiquing the entire patriarchal society. I don't know if Asian American men had much literary representation. Some of the literature before even The Women Warrior, written by Asian American men, were pretty brutal in their assessment of the position of Asian American men in American society. It was pretty sad. I mean, certainly they weren't given their due in this book. But even in general, in literature, I don't think there was even that much popular depiction as the equivalent of Joy Luck Club. I don't think there are any. And I think it's right that maybe it's high time to have more of these books written.
I think Wayne Wong realized the possibility of these criticisms when adapting the Joy Luck Club. It's probably why he made one of the husbands Chinese, gave Lena a new, kind, good-looking Asian partner, and made a point to highlight the heart-to-heart moment between June and her father at the end.
I love you, Daddy.
But I also don't think a movie has to perfectly depict, every expectation of representation in a group. It has to tell its story, and oftentimes the attempt to meet that kind of representation can get in the way of telling the truth of the story, which, reality is ultimately a little bit complicated.
Like I've said before, it's important to remember the Joy Luck Club was not intended to be a perfect image of all Asian American experiences, only a reflection of Amy Tan and her mother's relationship with each other and the world. So any flaw or misrepresentations are not definitive reflections of anything except her own experiences.
Before I was published, I never felt the self-consciousness that results from an unknown public reading my stories. It didn't occur to me that the details of the story might raise questions about what was being represented as a larger sociological phenomenon about mixed marriages. So what I wrote was only based on the familiar. My husband is not Chinese, and my American-born friends and relatives married non-Chinese partners. People might say this is proof that we American-born Chinese believed white people were more desirable. I think the choice of white men or women as spouses was related more to opportunity. The opportunity to meet a lot of Caucasians and the few opportunities to meet other Chinese people. My mother once confided in me that she had expected I would marry a foreigner.
I see a lot of parallels between the way Amy Tan and Maya Angelou's works are regarded by the men in their communities. Like Tan, Angelou faced relentless criticism for her unsavory depictions of, in her case, black men. But I think it's unfair for either of them to hold the responsibility of painting universally ideal pictures of their communities, especially as they're highlighting the subjugation of women. Like many of the people I talked to touched on, as well as people who worked on the film itself, this lack of nuance with the male characters was primarily discussed as a problem with the Joy Luck Club only because for decades, this was the only mainstream all Asian American representation.
It can't possibly do everything, so every film has its problems. Those problems has to be remedied by another film that also falls within the same genre. You can demand every single, say, feminist film to have a good man in it, just as much as you can demand every single anti-racism film to have a non-racist white man in it. Sometimes the story doesn't demand that character's existence, and it's perfectly fine, as long as not every single film does that. Right? So in this case, this film has problem depicting the nuance in China, has problem depicting the nuance in men, yet paradoxically, this one film is also every film for like 30 years. So this one film's problem become every film's problem. The dosage is small, yet paradoxically is everything it happens.
Yes. I've talked before about the burden of representation, the pressure that can be placed upon a single story, and how that pressure only intensifies when the umbrella is so large. I've seen arguments that there's a responsibility when it comes to telling these stories. Since there have been so many stereotypical depictions and so few realistic portrayals, there always seems to be someone who gets the short end of the stick. From Flower Drum Song to the Joy Luck Club to Crazy Rich Asians and everything in between, there's always somebody left out. The desire to get it right becomes an impossible task. In an essay responding to many of the criticisms The Woman Warrior received, Maxine Hong Kingston wrote, Now, I agree with these critics. The book is personal and subjective and singular. It may even be one of a kind, unique, exceptional. I am not a sociologist who measures truth by the percentage of times behavior takes place. Those critics who do not explore why and how this book is different, but merely point out its difference as a flaw, have a very disturbing idea about the role of the writer. Why must I represent anyone besides myself? Who's Considered Asian American has grown to encompass many more ethnicities than I think was originally envisioned when students at UC Berkeley conceived the term. But regardless, the idea was to create a common, unifying identity, to work towards social progress. In the Joy Luck Club, Tan notes how even within China, it was difficult to foster that sense of unity.
Everybody looked down on someone else. It didn't matter that everybody shared the same sidewalk to spit on and suffered the same fast-moving diarrhea. We all had the same stink, but everybody complained someone else smelled the worst.
There's always this pressure on like, oh, this is the first, or this is maybe one of the only things that we have in America representing this group. So that creates a whole level of pressure and a whole level of complexity towards producing it, because there are so many different questions that have to get asked now about like, oh, so why would you cast this person as this? Oh, so why would you choose to use this part of the story but not this part of the story? It makes it extremely challenging to avoid like harsh critique in some senses and to make everybody happy.
I definitely feel that criticism is healthy, you know, like we deserve that in order to get better stories. At the same time, when Crazy Rich Asians came out, it was very interesting to see just kind of all the expectations heaped onto this movie when ultimately it's a rom-com, right? So we don't expect that from, 13 going on 30 to like carry the hopes and dreams of everyone, and so I think that the answer has always just been to make more stories, but because we are just in these like nascent stages of Asian American representation, it's very difficult to convince people like, okay, there's going to be more. I think the first is always going to have that burden, and I think that with it comes the necessity for patience. The Joy Luck Club is interesting in that I think it took such a huge swing for its time.
Tan wrote the novel as a reflection of her own experiences as a Chinese American woman, but in a way, the film provided an opportunity for all Asian Americans to be seen. Wayne Wong clearly understood the significance of this when he cast actors like Tamlin Tomita and Qiu Qin, both of whom were actors of non-Chinese descent. He said, "The stories reminded me so much of the stories I heard from my parents, and I felt the book transcended just being Chinese."
He said that it doesn't matter what language you speak. I just want you emotional. I just want you feeling. So at the scene, if you really listen when I cry out, I did not speak English or Chinese. I speak Vietnamese.
Knowing all of this, we can see how the theme of wanting to be seen extended beyond the text of the novel, in ways Tan may not have envisioned. As a kid, I honestly didn't think that deeply about wanting to see Asian faces in popular American media. I guess it was something I was just used to never having, so I was content with just enjoying whatever was out there. But I did start noticing certain patterns. The sound of a gong whenever Asian characters appeared, the tired one-note jokes, and the fact that their Asianness made up the entirety of their personalities. Because of this, I started to headcanon other characters as Asian, like Batman Beyond. He even shared my name. When he was written as half Asian in 2022, my inner 10-year-old self felt so vindicated. Somewhere along the line, I found myself searching for more stories that included Asian people, and that grew to wanting to see Asian Americans, stories about them and by them. I've already responded at length to people who argue that it doesn't matter. You can see the breakdown in my Fresh Off the Boat video, or pause here for an abbreviated explanation. Anyway, this is why it's important to understand the significance for a story like Joy Luck to succeed as a novel and film, especially when the history and participation of Asian Americans in this country had so often been overlooked and pushed aside.
Pre-Joy Luck Club, we were relegated to roles playing the servant, playing the maid. There was a moniker that, oh, you're going in for the gook, the gangster, or the geisha, the 3 Gs.
So the people that I was able to see were Nancy Kwan and Flower Drum Song, and the people who had to do more what we would call stereotyped roles.
Lisa Liu was a supporting role in an episode of Shirley Temple's storybook, second fiddle to the lead in Yellowface. Sai Chin was a classically trained actress, but as Tamlin Tomita put it, do you think she should be as well regarded as Judi Dench or Glenda Jackson or all the Harry Potter actors? Of course. But because she's Chinese, she didn't have a shot. And they were pretty much all typecast as sexy, exotic women for the most part. There were plenty of actors with the credentials to do more, but they were rarely given the chance. And along with its impact on these actors' individual careers, the lack of representation left a lasting psychological impression on generations of Asian Americans. In 2019 and 2020, Nickelodeon's Shades of Us surveyed children 9 to 12 to understand the effects of representation, and found that not only did children overall regard Asian characters as most fit to be nerds or sidekicks, but that Asian children did too. Also, just to add, Latino kids were the only group that received an "I don't know" as one of the top 4 responses for how they would be cast, indicating a severe underrepresentation. So y'all clearly need some love too. Remember, this study was done 30 years after the Joy Luck Club, so we can only imagine what the results might have been in 1990.
I think representation is really important for kids. Kids don't have the political literacy to unpack all the things that you and I might have a conversation about. They just see, oh, a face. Maybe I could do that too.
It's important that children, I think, have access to these things because they don't really know what they're capable of. We kind of have to hold their hand at the start.
In 2024, some may feel like this yearning for acceptance that existed in previous generations has dissipated. An example of this is the simple idea of bringing Asian food for lunch. A few of the people I spoke to brought up how they wouldn't even have dreamed of it just 10 to 15 years ago.
I wasn't ever confident enough to bring Indian food to school. Like I couldn't do that as a kid because I knew I would, oh man, it would be so bad. But like my brothers don't care at all. So there is a big difference.
I don't think you could have that moment and just be like, yeah, I brought seaweed to school and have no one question it. I think that Gen Z has this other upper leg, which is that they grew up with the internet. From there, we're able to learn a lot more about ourselves and then other cultures, but they start so much younger. And I think that that does have such a profound impact.
I think that the internet really showed that plenty of different types of people can make stuff, can grow audiences. I think now the industry is more so accepting of social media and new media because once they see the dollar signs, then they're going, oh yeah, we'll use that, we'll work with that, we'll promote on that. Yeah, of course.
People are able to like express themselves on the internet and people do it all the time. So when you see that and you see other people doing it, that kind of gives a certain confidence in you to kind of express that as well.
In the movie, she had to deny her own ethnic identity because it wasn't acceptable. If she stood out and said, well, I'm Chinese, she will be further marginalized, but no longer. And today, I think it is a point of pride, but all that is to say, there's still discrimination. It's kind of two sides of the same sword. You are now more proud to identify as your ethnic identity. At the same time, though, you are also going to be risking being discriminated against because of all the other political attacks on being Asian American.
Am I supposed to bow to say hello?
China and America? Of course, are friends.
Can you guys take care of North Korea for us?
Wow, that is too much.
So China can keep ripping us off?
I guess.
Dr. Chow's words are a reminder that even if the need to be accepted has lessened, it's clear that the status of Asian Americans, no matter how long we've been here, can be collectively repositioned in an instant.
The Chinese virus, Kung flu.
The culture where people eat bats and snakes and dogs.
Here at home, Asian Americans are facing more than just the fear of contracting the virus.
Hate crimes against Asian Americans in major U.S. cities surged by nearly 150% in 2020.
The Asian American community has been faced with effectively 2 pandemics.
There is a very palpable climate of fear.
I think because of various cultural reasons, there's reluctancy to speak out, be stoic, right? To not try to cause trouble.
Entertainment is just a small reflection of how our voices often go unheard. For instance, Asian American voter turnout has historically been lower than that of other demographics, which is greatly attributed to a cultural indifference about politics, despite research showing that Asian Americans hold strong opinions on relevant issues. Yet as recently as 2012, only 31% of Asian Americans were contacted by political campaigns, in comparison to the national average of 53%. Among many takeaways, the study concluded that Asian American diversity and distinct experiences are often overlooked and not well understood in national political debates. Of course, there are many factors at play here, like the large population of naturalized citizens that make up the demographic, but it still demonstrates the continued willingness to neglect the Asian presence in America, reinforcing the state of invisibility.
There's white folks, there's black folks, and we really have failed to talk about anyone who is not in one of those two groups. Asian Americans are a surprise in terms of the racial discourse of this country. It's because we've really only had the conversation in this one way where it's a racial binary.
Discussing representation in entertainment only reflects some of the larger issues at hand, issues we can't lose sight of, even if, perhaps especially if, we also care about celebrating Asian American stories.
People who think that if we just get more Asians to succeed in a capitalist Hollywood industry, then that fixes racism. There's no class analysis, there's no thought for anything beyond just that very superficial idea.
We grew up with the phrase that's been beaten to death, representation matters, right? But now it's not just that, it's what kind of representation matters, like who, how, what are the narratives, and then what does that even mean when you have so many different Asian American groups?
Where do we, understand like how these stories can empower us to do something in our own world versus getting out of the mentality of looking at films as vehicles for celebrity worship?
I don't really have a simple answer for do I care about representation. The short answer is I do, but also it's not that simple, because I think people oversimplify the issue as if all that needs to happen to fix things is just more people getting hired. And it's so much more complicated and multifaceted than a lot of people are willing to really dig into.
Above all, regardless of what we may see on screen or even experience in real life, we can't let other people tell us who we are. They don't determine our identities.
And I had so many readers who said, I feel as though you've written my life. That was how I felt. And I thought, well, that's probably what happened to people who grew up in the 50s and the 60s, and it's probably not happening today because we've progressed in the United States beyond that. But no, I find I have a lot of young people coming up to me and say, that's how I felt. That's how I still feel. What I would say to that person is, it's hard to believe, but this feeling changes over time. And what you'll find ultimately is that this whole question of who you are is a very, very interesting question. And having two cultures to add to the mix of it makes it even more interesting. The whole idea that identity is what you create. It's not foisted upon you.
I've never really felt home in one ethnic group, but I also think that that's kind of life in a lot of ways. Even for people who grow up 100% Chinese in China, you're going to feel some level of disconnect with your culture and with your family and with your ethnic identity and popular culture especially. For mixed folks, like, we're kind of used to this. Like I said, identity is a very fragile thing. It's a very nebulous thing. It's very arbitrary. It shouldn't be this constant struggle of, oh, but I'm not American enough. Oh, but I'm not Asian enough. It should be, as a person in this position with these intersections, here's my story, and here's what it means, and here's what I can do for other people, and here's what I can do for myself, and here's what I will pass on to my next generation, and here's what I want to pass on to my kids, and here's how I want to affect society.
The struggle is never ending. It's important not to get complacent, to be involved in the change we want to see. It took generations of Asian Americans scratching and clawing just to be portrayed on screen with a modicum of respect and dignity, let alone treated with it. To tell the truth, the Joy Luck Club didn't really accomplish what it set out to. At the time, there was a belief it would open the doors for Asian American actors and stories, but the film was only a modest success, and while it didn't exactly fade into obscurity, it didn't make the sweeping waves many hoped it could.
It's about the money machine. So there always has to be a balance between making money, because that's how we are in a capitalistic society, it's honest. But we also have to balance it with the integrity of stories being told. And it doesn't always necessarily have to be just about Asians, because we're Asian North Americans in this room. But we have to support our gay LGBTQ brothers and sisters. We have to support our Black brothers and sisters, our Latinos, our indigenous peoples. We have to support everyone to make sure that their stories don't get invisibilized. It's just about, saying that we have hearts, we have souls, we have minds, we have faults, we have flaws, and we're super freaking interesting.
Storytelling is a powerful force. and some of us might even be ready to see new kinds of portrayals altogether.
A lot of previous stories reached into the past and were kind of like these historical accounts, and those are awesome. But we also should be allowed to create, a future. I like the light stuff too. Raunchy stuff, we need sweet stuff, we need important things and emotional things. There is a space for all of that.
Yeah, I do think that there's been an uptick, and I'm really happy about it. Even if the quality isn't always there, or even if it's the same story again, I do think that they're at least putting different spins on it.
Dude, I want it all. I want all of it. I want the good, the bad. You don't often associate Indian people with rock or with punk. These people exist in every corner of life. I'm just very excited and half wanting to create.
Well, I think there's so much rich literature out there now, and it'd be great when all of these different categories and genres can be blended more. And then I think you have the audience being even more welcoming and understanding of the Asian American community.
In terms of what I want to see more of, well, it would be cool to see more Filipino characters represented in mainstream media. I'm just glad in the direction Asian representation is going in terms of movies and shows. So definitely get more of that in.
I don't think it is as much as a achievement in representation as it's a win for diverse story. Whether or not you are racial minority or majority, whether or not you are man or woman, we all win at the end by having more different stories to see, more films to enjoy, and not everything is the exact same thing.
Buy more stuff on physical media, and I'm normally not into consumerism, but it's actually a really big problem right now. Whatever you're interested in, look for more of that, because there's probably more hidden gems out there that you've not yet discovered that could use the support.
We kind of need to see a lot of different perspectives, I think, to just feel like, okay, there's a space for us, because right now there is very little. Hopefully over time that changes, and I'm hopeful that it will.
Storytelling, it's so vital. It's the thing that has carried so many civilizations since the beginning of time. And so we should regard storytelling as this really important profession. It's the stories that we tell about our culture and our world that survive and that inform future generations and that inform us about what to do about our current world. And because of that, was there anything more important?
Like I said in the past, a small step forward is still a step forward. Today, there's greater appreciation and understanding of Asian Americans than ever, and clearly an appetite for more stories about us, in part thanks to the foundation set by the Joy Luck Club. Joy Luck only exists because Amy Tan made a real effort to understand her mother. For some of us, this might not be a possibility for a multitude of reasons, but for those of us with the capacity for it, talk to the people who came before you and take an interest in their lives. Discover the origins of their annoying quirks and nurture those relationships into something you can cherish for a lifetime. These connections transcend literature and media, but storytellers are the ones who preserve them. When we're long gone, these stories will be the only things left. I asked all the guests in this video what they wanted to see moving forward, and now I'll extend the question to you. What do you want to see? Or maybe even create? We all encompass limitless possibilities, so if no one else is making them a reality, why not you? This is probably my last video about representation for a while. Just like everybody else, I'm more than just my ethnicity, so I'm looking forward to writing about music and whatever else I care about that may or may not relate to Asian stories. I want to keep making videos that genuinely mean something to me, but YouTube's been making that really difficult for us to sustain. So if you like our videos, consider supporting us on Patreon. Thanks so much to our patrons for helping out and just being there and talking to us. And I also want to thank everybody I talked to in the video. Dr. Chow, Yang from Accident Cinema, Cheyenne, Yusra from Brown Fireball, Jenevia, Elliot, Anna Isabel, Saji, and Kimmy. I couldn't have done any of this without their insight, and I'm just so grateful that they took the time to talk to me. And thank you for watching. It really means a lot. Also, go register and vote. I'll see you next time. Peace.